Hello all, this is Jarin Jove with my podcast and quasi-YouTube video, Candid Questioning, in which I'll be making outspoken videos critiquing and forming arguments based on scientific research, statistics, rational skepticism, and my own human bias. For my first video, I'll be critiquing and criticizing Sargon of Akkad. Why am I criticizing Sargon? On his Patreon page, Sargon says he's creating arguments, but many of his arguments fail at forming a premise, and even in instances when he does have a premise, he fails at showing how his conclusions follow from the premise. Often, in his lengthy videos, he only uses cherry-picked anecdotal examples and not statistical evidence as his research. Just as relevant, even for the valid arguments that Sargon has, Sargon fails at forming appropriate context, such as connecting the infamous cop killer, Assata Shakur, as an ideological root of Black Lives Matter, in his video, The Ideological Root of Black Lives Matter. Sargon instead spreads fear-mongering through anecdotal videos of one or two protesters in different rallies across the US espousing hateful speech within that specific video. And he focuses the spotlight only on the most inflammatory comments recorded by news media. And of course, news media does the same thing to get the most clicks instead of providing the statistical evidence of the percentage of people who believe in and espouse such hateful rhetoric. This video will largely be a response and dissection of his video, The Ideological Root of Black Lives Matter. If you haven't watched it, then you probably won't be able to follow along on what I'm talking about, as I'm not going to take Sargon's video and just put my own voice over it, because that would obviously be wrong and possibly be copyright infringement. If you are curious about the video, I think it's important to watch it before this one. Please be advised that Sargon begins it with the footage of the torture of a handicapped person without any warning to the viewers. So here's my warning to let you know, since Sargon failed to respect his own viewers with that consideration. When I watched that video, I was immediately bombarded with the torture footage, and Sargon provided no warning before beginning the video in that manner. If you're a fan of Sargon, I doubt you'll be convinced of anything in this critique video that I'm making. In this and future videos, I'll be quite candid on my positions because, hey, candid questioning. I also am left-leaning in many of my views, and I don't mean the so-called classical liberal that Sargon identifies himself as, but rather the so-called SJW left that he and others mark. So then, let's start. Right off the bat, in his video, as I just mentioned, Sargon began the video by showing the violent torture of a handicapped white individual by two black people with no prior warning. The purpose of this was to make his viewers feel fear and anger over a horrific torture. The reaction by the viewer is understandable, but the purpose by Sargon is disingenuous. Since this was a video about Black Lives Matter, you would obviously attribute this horrific crime to them, and he knew that. After showing the video as the opening of his Ideological Root of Black Lives Matter video, Sargon then claims that it had nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. So then, I'd like to pose this question. Why did he show it at all in his video, specifically about the roots of Black Lives Matter? What was the point? After a slew of cut and edited footage filled with anecdotes, specifically of a handful of black people who said dumb things in various protests across the US, he then states that the torturers of the handicapped white individual were influenced by Black Lives Matter, and that their rhetoric while torturing the handicapped young man was proof of BLM's influence. After he states this, much later in the video, he then says that he went after his detractors on Twitter by accusing them of lying for saying that he accused the 2 black torturers of being influenced by BLM. So, which is it? And again, if he is saying that BLM had nothing to do with the torture, then why did he put it in a video about his problems with BLM right in the beginning? And why didn't he give his audience a few seconds of warning at least? But more than that, this is a complete self-contradiction. Later on, Sargon shows no causal link as to how these torturers were influenced by Black Lives Matter. He says their rhetoric is proof at one point, but he doesn't show how BLM had anything to do with the rhetoric. Popular slogans can be said by anybody. If there is a stronger connection, then he didn't show it in his video. After that, he claims that Assata Shakur of the black supremacist group, the Black Liberation Army, a woman who was convicted for the murder of a state trooper at a New York Jersey turnpike, and who fled to Cuba in 1979 and has remained in Cuba since then, is somehow influencing Black Lives Matter to be a hate group based on black supremacy. He is making a very bold claim with no causal link to establish how she is influencing them. In his video, there are no self-reported statistics on how many Black Lives Matter protesters agree with the Black Liberation Army or Assata Shakur's black supremacist views specifically. No widespread literature, website, or other paraphernalia that Black Lives Matter could be using to connect them to the Black Liberation Army's views. No verifiable proof that the prayer chant footage has any connection to any of Assata Shakur's writings, as he doesn't bother to cite any passages from her manifesto or any writing of hers, but claims that he has evidence by linking to a book without giving any cited passages and failing to go into any details about what he means. He just fails at this completely. No evidence that Shakur herself has any contact at all with any leadership from the BLM movement. The most surprising part of all this is that he did have some good evidence for this claim. He did. But he totally failed at explaining to the viewer how it was connected. Researching his blog, which he uses as his only source in the description box, he cites sources in his blog post and not in his description box below the video for some strange reason. He should have just put all of the sources into the description box so people knew what those sources were instead of just... Never mind. In his blog citations, besides articles listing anecdotes, he doesn't have any sources that focus on statistical data of how many people who are part of BLM support Assata Shakur's violent and racist views, or even aware of her existence. Sources in his blog are mostly citing the clipped anecdotal footage that he uses. As I said before, he does have some evidence, so this argument of his wasn't completely hopeless. He cites the blog of Garza, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, who does use Assata's work and manifesto chant. But now this leads me to have another question. Why didn't he cite this in his video and go into more details about it? He had the evidence, but he never explained to the viewer how it connected. He didn't go into any details on how Assata Shakur could be connected to BLM when she's been confined to Cuba since the late 70s, how Garza espouses Shakur's chant, or the basis for why she does it. If you're willing, please pause here and read Garza's explanation in Garza's own written words. For my part, from having read the entire blog post, My general impression is that Garza wants to rebrand the Black Liberation Army into a more peaceful movement, but this strikes me as callous because she seems to be trying to separate Assata Shakur, the person, from Assata Shakur's manifesto, which was a bad decision as Shakur's beliefs are what led her to her violent path in life. Assata Shakur was convicted of murdering a state trooper, and there's no getting around that. And she has a very checkered history based on her significant involvement with the violence of the Black Liberation Army. There's no getting around that either. She's not an icon worth respecting, and Garza's actions lead me to believe that she's just trying to, dare I say, whitewash Assata Shakur's image with one that is no different from the whitewashed image of murderers like Christopher Columbus that people in the US still defend today, which, honestly, they really should not. All that aside, Sargon failed at elaborating the appropriate context that Garza was the originator of preaching Shakur's manifesto, and just didn't mention this very solid piece of evidence in his favor. All he did do was say BLM had roots in a black supremacist group, without going into any details on what one of the founders was espousing, or how it even connected to Assata Shakur. He just didn't explain this at all. It's bizarre. He had this evidence, but he didn't go into any details about it. But all that aside, even accepting the solid evidence from a cited source that Sargon never bothers to mention even once in his video to connect Assata Shakur to BLM, he has not established that the majority know about or espouse Shakur's violent beliefs. Garza, in what I feel is a poor decision, is trying to rebrand what was essentially a violent, racial supremacist and anti-government group into a peace movement, which I find ridiculous. But as BLM is a decentralized, social media-driven group with no real leadership, whose stated goal is the end to police violence against black people in the United States, there needs to be a solid statistical basis for Sargon's argument that the majority of BLM protesters believe in Shakur's manifesto. If Sargon can't provide that, then his argument is bunk. The official BLM stance is clearly not what Sargon has argued. The burden of proof is still on Sargon to show that this is anything more than a few dozen people in a movement that has hundreds of thousands protesting against police violence specifically. If he's going to make the claim that the majority of BLM follow some violent, hardly recognizable figure from the 1970s, then he needs to provide the statistics. Now, a possible question might be, what if BLM is hiding their connection to her? If Sargon, or anyone else, is going to argue that the Black Lives Matter movement is hiding it throughout the US, then that's an even bolder claim, and the burden of proof is on them to show it, as that goes into conspiracy theorist territory. The final part of his video is particularly asinine. Rattling off news headlines isn't evidence of any sort, it's just lazy fear-mongering. He clearly hasn't read any of these articles. Furthermore, this is inconsistent with the belief that the mainstream media espouses fake news, and these articles might possibly be making incendiary headlines and then espousing the opposite position. It's not uncommon. When I was confronting him on Twitter about all of this, he tried redirecting the conversation and claimed that BLM never protested the death of a white Australian woman, Justine Damond, who was murdered by a black police officer. This was his proof of BLM's inherent racism. Judging from my personal experience with him, he immediately tries to make incendiary comments to get likes on Twitter and to deflect criticism by ignoring them. It's not an uncommon tactic from demagogues. To no surprise to anyone who does 5 minutes of research on this topic, what Sargon tried to argue is flat out wrong. Here's an article to prove it on the screen. If you don't believe me, then please just read the article. There's the link, and I've put it under the sources in the description box below. Now, if you're going to argue that this article is fake news, then please explain why Sargon, citing media headlines as evidence, is not also utilizing so-called fake news. By the way, I've actually read this article before citing it. I doubt Sargon has done the same for his. The reason Sargon just spouted off headlines was the same reason that he used spliced clips of only the dumbest comments by a few protesters, instead of showing full clips of what the majority of protesters had to say, or providing any statistical surveys to lend any real credibility to his argument. He just wanted to make his viewers feel angry and helpless. We've already seen and experienced this very same tactic from the mainstream media when they lied about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq back in 2003. Or when they depicted the Tea Party as a hate movement back before Fox News and CNN mutilated it with the Obama birther nonsense, instead of the legitimate grievances against government corruption that was ruthlessly pushed out of the mainstream focus, or when the mainstream vilified Occupy Wall Street for supposedly not having a goal while ignoring their stated demands against the corruption of the U.S. political and economic system, and then further ignoring when the New York City police violated their First Amendment rights to assembly by forcibly removing them. Now look, I am well aware of why people justifiably don't trust the mainstream media anymore. If you want a different news source and don't trust the mainstream media, then please don't use YouTubers online who live at home and rattle off whatever opinions they feel like, depending on the time of day. That's not news, and Sargon certainly isn't a skeptic. I can understand no longer having any trust in the mainstream media news sources, but especially after the Iraq War of 2003, but YouTubers who give opinions and who fail to do any meaningful research, even from credible sources that they have, and who give you disingenuous representations of real-life situations, are very clearly not the answer for trusted news sources. I wouldn't be saying this if I hadn't met people who continuously sent me Sargon videos as proof of the authenticity of their views when I asked them for news sources in online arguments and discussions with them. I think a crucial problem with the mainstream media is that they downsized and decreased investigative journalism, which for all intents and purposes should be the main focus of a news organization. If you want more news organizations that offer investigative journalism and don't pander to the elite, then might I suggest independent news organizations that do investigative journalism. And no, I don't mean Vox or BuzzFeed, even though I'm an SJW liberal. I mean the independent news sources that have the stated goal of investigating and fighting incidents of government corruption. Perhaps try Revealnews.org, a subsidiary of the Center for Investigative Journalism, which refuses to take money from corporate interest groups and whose stated goal is to engage and empower the public through investigative journalism and groundbreaking storytelling in order to spark action, improve lives, and protect our democracy. Or Propublica, a nonprofit news organization that stated mission is to expose abuses of power and betrayals of the public trust by government, business, and other institutions using the moral force of investigative journalism to spur reform through the sustained spotlighting of wrongdoing. Now, that probably all sounds nice, but you might be skeptical as to their authenticity. So I've linked an about link for both of these news sources. And I've also linked ProPublica's Impact link, which is their own self-assessment to show their donors and viewers how well they're doing with their news stories spurring change and reform. Now, to be totally candid though, I'm unsure if anyone who watches Sargon regularly will bother taking the advice that I just gave. It basically falls to deaf ears, I feel, because Sargon's viewers don't even seem to be aware that they're falling into the same blatantly obvious tactic that the mainstream media used to spread fear and hate. It's for the very same reason that people left the mainstream media. Sargon, like the mainstream media, makes a collage of a few people throughout the country saying dumb things to argue that the entire movement is representative of them. Instead of evaluating the group based on their stated goals, the background reasons for what actually started these movements, or survey questions answered by thousands of self-described supporters, Sargon uses the same tactic as that the mainstream media already perfected. He takes around 20 or 30 people, cuts videos to them saying dumb things, and then says the majority of hundreds of thousands agree with them. Then he yammers on and says even more offensive speech that the viewers think is justified because they feel angry and fearful from the clips that they just watched, serving as confirmation bias and a negative form of pattern recognition. Honestly, it's so easy to spot Sargon's disingenuous actions, but beyond that, I have to congratulate this man. He'll be making $108,624 each year from this style of video. Oh, and if you're a Sargon fan about to respond that what I just said doesn't match the number of the image on the screen, well, you just proved my point. I was going to explain why, but if you don't know why, then you don't know math. If Sargon isn't making monthly payments as his setting on his Patreon, he chose the per content option, then he's making far more than what I just said. I honestly have to hand it to this man. He was able to convince people to pay him their money to feel fear and anger instead of just watching the mainstream media to get that for free. Sargon, you are a brilliant scam artist. I'm sorry, Sargon. I meant content creator. You're a brilliant content creator. Also, it's interesting how you would claim to be a rationalist, but question the veracity of the 9/11 terror attacks. But hey, you're definitely good with convincing people to give you money by spreading fear and hate. Props. Dear viewers, thank you for listening to this podcast. If you would, please like, share, comment, and subscribe if you liked my content. If you feel I deserve it, please consider supporting me through Patreon. If you have questions, tweet me at Jarin Jove or email me. Thank you.